you know, we still need the stories, whether we read modern novels or not. It's like, you know, we need that connection, whether it's with our elders or with our kids. You know, we pass these stories on as something precious. For me personally, it's probably just the unknown, you know. I've always been drawn more to the unknown and whatever the beyond of normal life. So I would actually go out and look for these. You know, we would go to haunted houses. We would go to haunted areas of the cities. See what was going on, you know? Yeah, now, whatever that comes from, I don't know. But it kept life interesting.
It was almost like an escape.
Definitely an escape. Family life was not a happy life. So that was an escape, definitely.
Hey, welcome to the Floaties for Krakens podcast. I am your host, Camille Maria Costa, and it is a brilliant day to be monstrous. Hi, Cuddlefish. Welcome back to our third part of the Lavender for Monsters Super Pride special. Can you believe it? We're here celebrating this beautiful month of June. How is everybody? Hopefully well, hopefully incredible, enjoying yourself, taking the time to, I don't know, just celebrate who you are and who you love. What a beautiful, beautiful month it is. And welcome to season 2, episode, oh my gosh, 16 of our show, of the Floaties for Krakens podcast. Gosh, what a great episode we have in store for you today. We're so excited to introduce to you the incredible, the amazing, the immaculate Dr. Rachel V. Gonzalez-Martin. Oh my gosh, I can speak volumes about this individual. Rachel was basically, I love her. I love her so freaking much. She's like my tia. I love her so deeply, and I have so much appreciation for her and what she does. To make a long story short, I first met Rachel a couple of years ago when I was first starting kind of my trajectory in the world of folklore studies in the academic field. I was at a conference, my very first conference academically for anything, and I felt very scared and very alone. And I was speaking about a topic that I was very passionate about. It was about the folk art that came about after the tragic, horrific shooting that happened in El Paso, Texas on August 3rd. And it moved me so much, and it was a very emotional, vulnerable thing to do, to present something like this, especially when you already had imposter syndrome and you weren't really sure what your place was supposed to be in the world of folklore. Anyway, in a sea of people that I just didn't know, including Rachel, right? She stood up during my presentation and she took pictures and she clapped and she stood, and I cried so hard because I was just so thankful that somebody saw me and appreciated me for what I was doing. Then I saw her speak, and her work is just absolutely beautiful. She's incredible. She's an associate professor for Latino studies. At University of Texas at Austin. I want to make sure I get her title right. She Mexican American and Latino studies. She's just incredible. She's just a freaking superhuman. She fights and writes for brown bodies, for Latina bodies, for queer bodies, for bodies that feel otherized or uncommon or strange or fearful, right? She has created so many amazing books, literature, pieces of literature, just works. She's working on an amazing work right now, which we will talk about in this episode. But God, she's just doing such groundbreaking work. And just the fact that she fights so hard for people that look like me, that may feel like we don't have a place in the world. It just makes me feel very happy and proud that she agreed to be on the show. I love you, Rachel, so much. I know we rarely get to see each other, but I hope you know that you standing for me, both in person and metaphorically all the time, does not go unnoticed. And I'm positive that there are millions of other little Latina bodies that feel the same. So keep doing the work that you do, because I promise you we're going to keep reading it and supporting it, because what you do is absolutely incredible. Yeah, we have a fun traditional folkloric spooky narrative for you today. I'm really excited for you all to listen, but yeah. Without further ado, ladies and cuttlefish, let me introduce to you, I believe yous, for La Lechuzas. Oh, also, I almost forgot. I just wanted to give a little bit of trigger warnings for this episode. We get into some pretty tough discussions, complicated discussions about abuse on women, sexual abuse, sexual violence, stalking, domestic violence, machismo, marianismo cultures in Latino cultures. So it's pretty heavy, but it's important to talk about these things because it happens. It happens. Violence amongst Latinas, amongst queer Latina bodies, it happens, and it needs to be talked about and discussed. So please do whatever you need to do to feel safe while listening to this episode. Don't listen to this episode if you don't want to. I totally understand. It's a tough one, but just know there's a safe place for you here. You're believed, and you're understood, and you're supported, and we love you. But yes, take care of yourselves, and we love you so much, Cuttlefish, just so you know. Okay, back to the episode. Well, hi.
Hello.
Hello again. How are you, Rachel?
I'm doing very well, Camille. Thank you for inviting me on this podcast. I'm excited
Always.
to participate.
And any chance I get to talk to you, I know, we rarely
We
get
try
to
so
we
hard.
see each other once, maybe, every year.
But I think it's a very enthusiastic meeting, and I don't think we should discount that. I was going to say, we always have such an enthusiastic meeting, like at AFS or in passing. So it's like, it's always good. And then it's like,
Always good.
it's 10 seconds, and they're like, okay, see you later. And then, I'm asleep in a hotel room going like, I can't see people. I laugh. I mean, I'll be honest with you, like, I love seeing people, especially people that I really care for, and like we work together. But lots of people, like too many people, I get zapped. And I was like, I'm
Of
gonna go hide in the
course.
bedroom right now, or hide in the hotel room and
Because to
watch
be
Forensic
honest,
Files.
yes, exactly that. Because I mean, if you think about it, especially you're so busy, and like those moments of like, although it's a work trip, like technically, right? Like it's
Yes.
also like I can sleep for a bit. I
Yeah.
can shut my eyes for a good few hours. It's
Yeah, and it feels good. It feels good. It feels like, oh. But
yeah.
it doesn't mean we get to miss longer conversations. So I'm super excited
I know.
for us to have a chance here.
Well, for people that may not know who are you? What do you do, Rachel? What do you love
No
to do? What are your
pressure.
passions?
Oh God. Okay. Oh God, that's a little harder. We'll start with the academic introduction. So,
Mhm.
my name is Rachel Gonzalez-Martin. I am an associate professor of Latino Studies at the University of Texas. I'm a folklorist. I was trained at Indiana University, so I have a PhD in folklore and ethnomusicology.
Mhm.
And I'm an anthropological folklorist. So I
Yes.
think in like Latino folklore studies, as we start to like carve out a name like Latino folklore studies, in my work, I call it Latinx folklore studies or
Yeah.
critical Latinx folkloristics. We just got to put a name on something so we can claim it. But part
Always.
of that is that historically, I feel like the specialization in thinking about like the US Mexico borderlands, Latinos and diaspora and folklore is very much a literary game. So people
Mm.
dealing more with things like personal experience narrative and memoir. Um, and I'm an anthropological folklorist, as in I go out and interview people and do those kinds of projects, and it's
Yeah.
mixed media. So I'm looking at, social media as a source or film or anywhere I can get a particular text that I'm excited about or that I'm working on. I kind of follow it down a rabbit hole. And that's different, let's say, than other folks, I'd say, in our field.
Right.
So my work in the past my work is always focused really on gender and public performance. So
Yeah.
first book, when you can say first book when you're trying really hard to write the second book. So my first book, it's called Quinceañera Style. So it's about the consumer culture around the popular tradition of coming of age at 15, the dresses, the music, the aesthetic manifestations of that. So
Yeah.
particularly thinking about Latina bodies and like public presentation of those bodies, whether they're brown or brown in theory,
Yeah.
and thinking about what does it mean to be publicly like Latina? What does it mean to be publicly racialized on your own terms? And it's something that's highly contestable, right? Once you're out in the street, people make comments or people compliment or people take pictures of you like it's a parade float when you're just on your way to your party, right? Um,
Mm.
so there's something about that kind of, I call it presencing, right? Having that presence. And I'm in Austin, Texas.
Yes.
So um, I see quinces all the time, like especially now in the warmer months, right? So there's this idea for me as thinking about in that book, thinking about what's normal for some people and what's spectacle for others, but this idea of that
Mm.
collectivity of knowing that you're a spectacle and sort of being open to that, right? Being
Yeah.
open to be publicly recognizable. And there's a certain amount of cultural and social responsibility to that, right? But it's also something, it's a political act, right? We're not going to shy away, particularly in
Yeah.
a state like Texas, which is quite conservative. And depending on where you are and where you're coming from, right? It can be a place where you might want to hide your skin tone, your accent, or even your heritage in a way
Mm.
to fit in better, right? It's still
Mm.
very much that kind of place. And so this idea of being publicly and spectacularly, unabashedly
Yeah.
Latina, right, to me is really fascinating. So I spent a lot of time picking at how the body is used as a platform, right? And so it was a lot of fun and it was really interesting. And I got to talk about dresses, so body aesthetics, and then thinking about gender, thinking about ideal femininity, thinking about queerness, thinking just about the burden on women, right? That comes with being sort of the traditional, the keepers of tradition, right?
Yeah.
And how that affects things like self-worth, or even thinking about when I think about the quince and I think about sort of where my research went, like in the end, it really became about this idea of like a whole generation of young women who really feel themselves and are excited to be out there. And then a generation of mothers who are kind of on the fence because they were not raised in to sort of have that capacity. And it comes
Yeah.
down to sort of these deeper questions of like desire, right? To want to be seen, to want to
Yeah.
be flashy, and how we both have a celebration that can very much be super flashy and super public, but we're also kind of punished for wanting that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a strange conflation about growing up and being a woman and sort of the contradictions that sort of define how we're allowed to sort of grow up and be. And then, that just becomes one note of like, wait a minute, who am I supposed to be? What do you want me to
How?
be? How am I supposed to do this? And so it thinks a lot about the kind of, and most of this is very personal, thinking about like, what kind of woman am I? I didn't, you just sort of, it allows you into these conversations where you realize how we're socialized, whether it's ethnic, race based, class based, region based, and the common ground that some of these traditions allow to coalesce, like, oh, whether I'm in Denver or I'm in El Paso or I'm
Yeah.
in Manhattan, right? The traditions themselves have these shared elements that allow us to be sort of connected. And so
Yes.
that's the first work. The first
Yes.
work has always been about that, but I love spooky things. I love monsters. I'm the meme that says I'm stressed. I'm gonna watch a serial killer documentary so I can go to bed. I listen to like true crime and a cryptid podcast before
Yeah.
bed, so I can just lull
Ease
myself to
into the
sleep.
night.
I love it. And so my first, like, so thinking about like I've always loved that kind of media and that kind of those kinds of stories
Yeah.
since I was young. Ghosts, everything, hauntings, this is my jam. But I never thought I would bring it into sort of the workspace, right?
Yeah.
And so now that I'm tenured, I'm just like, I'm gonna write about something else. Like I was like, how do I bring in the spookiness? And so this next project, this book
Ah,
that I'm working on is on monstras, right? Female monsters in Latinx legends, but specifically focusing on the narrative of La Lechuza, which I know we'll get to,
yep.
but it's actually really about, and I was talking to one of my mentors about this, and she's like, I was giving her my notes. I'm like, I have notes, but like nothing else. And it's all about this idea of affect. What kind of affect, it's going back to this idea of public presentation or kind of personality, who Latino women are allowed to be.
Mm.
And that came, so there's this idea of thinking about predatory women, thinking about monsters in general and the politics of that. And then thinking about Lorena Bobbitt, which you're young. I don't know if you recall the news about Lorena Bobbitt. I was probably 10. And so Lorena Bobbitt is known sort of infamously as the woman that cut off her
Mm-hmm.
husband's penis, right?
Yep.
And it was national news. It was this huge thing. It was scandalous, but she was also really made a monster in media. And in the
Yeah.
last probably 5 or 6 years, there's been a variety of different like reality documentary series about her. And I was watching one because I like all that kind of, I was like,
Of
oh yeah,
course.
and she's just like the quietest, kind of most meek woman, and even seems kind of into sort of like this, the media flurry around her, like her crime and what she was doing was so severe, it kind of stunted her. Like she's sort of,
Mm.
hasn't been allowed to be anything other than that
That.
monster. And I
Yeah.
had no idea. Like I remember watching the news and seeing these stories, and thinking about how much I didn't think she was wrong. I remember being a kid thinking about, like, you probably deserved it. Like,
Yeah.
you probably
Yeah.
did something. And even though later it came out that there was this, history of spousal abuse, the narrative that was sort of used against her was that she was this like crazy, mad Latin woman, right?
Yeah.
And this it might not seem normal to us, but in her home country, right? And you're like,
This
what are you
is,
talking about?
yeah.
Yeah, this. And so she, I didn't even realize she was an immigrant from Ecuador, like who had come.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how, and he was a retired Marine. I was like, oh Lord, like there's so many things happening with this. But
Yeah.
this idea of one, her being made a monster made me, and I just remember thinking like, oh, how horrible. And I was like, I think she seems pretty great to me. So part of that in my mind, and so this is what I realized, like thinking about this more, was there was some patterning in my upbringing as a Mexican American woman, or just a woman, raised in the 90s, born in the 80s, um, in an urban. I'm from California. I'm
Yeah.
from the urban Bay Area. I grew up in Oakland. So I was always surrounded by the idea of crime and being fearful and violence and danger. But
Mhm.
I also was raised with the assumption of masculine violence, or this idea that in my mind, like to me, it wouldn't be, of course, like she probably fought back. Like, so somewhere in my
Mhm.
mind, it
Mhm.
was very much like that is the outcropping of an experience that I might identify with for whatever
Hmm.
reason, right? And I've come from a long line of Mexicana, women on my mom's side who were very strong, but also endured quite a bit of
Yeah.
social violence and domestic
Yeah.
violence, and have these stories, and some of which are like getting away, some of which are fighting back. And so, you grow up with these ideas of like, you gotta be tough, you gotta be strong, almost like the acceptance that something might happen to you, so you fight back.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
hearing about this to me, I was like, so thinking about this, just as the idea of monstrosity. And of course, Lorena
Yes.
Bobbitt is this tiny woman. She's petite, she's soft spoken, like thinking about like in comparison to her partner. And just kind of, I'm just like laughing to myself, like, I didn't think she was a monster. Nothing wrong with what
Yeah.
she did. She probably defended herself. Like, and so in my mind, I'm thinking, monster stories are interesting. And so that really got me thinking about wanting to sort of understand about how both the cultural narratives, our legends, the stories that are passed down more informally, that are very much embedded with gender and regional identities, and sort
Mhm.
of this public mass culture depictions, and like how they sort of come together. And I feel like they come together around this Latina immigrant woman. And for me, it really comes back to this idea of relatability. Like, I am definitely Team Lorena, not Team John Wayne Bobbitt. And in my mind, it's like who could not be,
Right.
right? And so trying to understand how monsters are made and why we
Mm.
need monsters, and particularly thinking about women as monstrous. And part of that is my dear, dear love of all things true crime. And I watch anything true crime that's on Netflix or any of the subscription services. I've seen it at least once, even when it's bad.
You're so brave,
Oh
Rachel.
my God, I sit there for hours. But part of it is, so there's always, so I think a lot about the stories that we tell and like this idea of shock. What is shocking? And women, violent women are shocking. So I watch these true crime and I'm thinking about like the stories I want to tell or the book I want to write. And there's always this idea of women, like this horrible woman who was slowly poisoning her husband, blah blah. I was like, she said that he beat her and he was a
Yeah.
jerk. And I was like, again, in my mind, I'm like, I don't know. He wants her to cook for him. He better, I'm just like,
Yeah,
in my
that
mind, there's a kind of like, there's a kind of acceptance. I'm like, good for her. And thinking
yeah.
about certain time periods, right? Where, we laugh with the idea. I think people were just commenting on the anniversary. I think it was in the early 70s. Where a woman before a period, women couldn't have credit without husbands or fathers, right? And so this
Mhm.
idea of saying, where we're thinking about responses to social pressures or responses to violence, right?
Yeah.
What resources have women had and how has that changed? And so this idea of thinking about monstrous women being creative. Oh, she killed her child or she killed her husband. It's like I'm kind of in my mind rephrasing as like maybe she's just resourceful. And these are the
Hmm.
resources that she has. Not to be like diminishing of violence, but just thinking about the alternate perspective because so much of what and you mentioned this idea of asking about what I think of as a monster, right? But thinking about
Right.
that monsters, right? We create monsters because we need monsters, but in some ways this idea is cultivated a little bit from within, like how we grew up and where we grew up and who we were around, and then the media that so much now, right, has such a strong presence on our everyday life.
Yeah.
And so this current project, right, is
Oh,
making
I
me look
love
at
it.
all sorts of ideas um, about not just monstrous women, but this where monstrosity and like being a bad woman
Yeah.
um, come into play. And so that's what I'll be developing as this
Oh,
moves forward. But more to come as we think about specific monsters for our purposes.
yeah. That's so exhilarating. That's so fun. Oh my God.
It
What a
is.
fun project.
Think I know people ask, depending on who they are, I was like, I'm talking about predatory women, and they're like, I'm like, it's great, no, it's good times, like this is
It's good time,
like
real fun.
we're super fun, and it kind of like you get some side eye from men. I was like, it's not about you unless you're following women into the woods, you following women into the woods because that's on you.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so yes, yes,
Oh, I love it. I love it. And I think it goes back to you talking about your first project, right? Your first book, which was the Quinceañeras, that
yeah,
research. And I loved how you explained kind of the constant, like, Mexican American women, and of course, Latina women, Latinx women in general,
yeah,
having to wear so many hats and really exist on the definition of a borderland, right? Like
yeah.
one foot here, one foot there, but also like 10 other feet in 10 other
Yeah, to
places
their arms and hands, it's
are
all
right.
yeah,
It's
right.
constantly trying to figure out their identity and who are they supposed to be, or tearing down these generational like pillars that have been built that are
Sure,
potentially problematic, right? And there's just
absolutely.
so much, and I love that you expressed how monstrous women have kind of always been introduced to you. They've always been in your world growing
Yeah.
up. You've seen it, you've felt it, you've
Mhm.
explored it, right? And I love that that is your inspiration behind this work. I think that is so
Absolutely.
cool.
But just thinking about that, so the first, like, okay, monstrous women are always present, right? And I
Right.
think it was weirdly, I grew up in a very patriarchal, household, Mexican
Yeah.
American, multi-generational house, pretty typical. But
Yeah.
so the idea of leveraging like La Llorona against, oh, don't go out or she's gonna get you.
Yeah.
And even not even realizing like how she became into being. Like I was definitely a kid who was taught to be afraid of La Llorona, but I didn't know her story. I just knew she
No.
was out there going to try to snatch you. And
Right.
then it took years, college. I'm like, that's so sad. She deserves support, not like why am I afraid of her? And this is this idea of kind of at the heart of getting at the function of monsters, right? Thinking about what does the fear do?
Hmm.
What is someone trying to do? What are communities trying to do? What are they trying to uphold
Yeah.
in making, especially kids, making us afraid. And I
Yeah.
think that's a big picture kind of question.
Yes. Fear is such a huge part of it. And
Mhm.
I mean, that's the interesting thing about defining what a monster is, right? Is it changes on context. It changes
Oh
depending
yeah,
on who's calling who a monster, right? Who has the
absolutely.
privilege of
Yeah.
telling their
Oh
story,
sure.
being
Yeah.
able to speak a story, right? And I mean, it's so complicated and convoluted. And I love this idea of you being a child and just like, not having the ability to learn the story.
Yeah.
Nobody told you the specifics of this
Mm-mm.
story. And now finding out for yourself and be like, oh no, 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 no. We are
Yeah.
screaming this story from the
Yeah.
rooftops. We are
Yeah.
we are telling the full picture, right? Like
Yeah.
it's important.
Yeah.
It's
So I think
important.
it's absolutely important. And that's something, so something I learned a lot with working with my students, like undergraduates, and thinking
Yeah.
about like the stories that they know or they don't know, because in some ways I feel like I'm just like talking to a younger version of myself, being like, no, no, if I had to wait till I was 25, you're 19. If you learn this now, you've got,
Yeah.
6 more good
Yeah.
years of a different life. And
Right.
I think that's significant because I think, when we think about the stories, the leyendas, even the
Yeah.
anecdotes that are really steeped in the traditional narratives, even if they're not exactly, let me tell you a story.
Yeah.
The traits that come through, I think, are extremely formative because of how close we are to our family. So we want what our father or our grandmother is saying to be the truth, and we want to follow it. And then
Yeah.
if you kind of grow up and separate a bit, go to college or get a job, move out, those sort of markers of distancing become questioning those stories. And then, honestly, on some levels, I remember being really confused about, wait, but who do I listen to?
Right.
Who?
Right.
And that's when you pull back and be like, I'm supposed to be listening to myself, right? So
Yeah.
there's this interesting kind of disconnect in where the stories work in a certain way until you create a kind of distance, and then things sort of fall apart and you have to regroup. And you either decide
Yeah.
you're going to be what you were trained to be or what you were socialized to be, or you're going to have to tell new stories
Yeah.
and question. And that is a little bit traumatic, right? But it's good, it's something that we do.
It's
Um,
hard.
I think about monsters and think it is, right? It is. And so one of the first line I'm writing this, my intro. I'm not even writing my intro yet. I'm writing notes to go into chapters, right? I
Right.
have a
Right.
wonderful undergraduate research assistant who made me some program thing that like I have like a notebook in Word or some other program. So I have these chapters like there with
Love
some
it.
notes, and I'm just like, okay. But I start with this idea that I identify as a monster.
Hmm.
And this is an interesting middle ground with understanding my own relationship to my family and my own sort of ambition or desire to be independent and live a life on my terms. And
Hmm.
so on some level, I'm trying to establish early on that monstrosity is very subjective, this idea of who is or what is a monster.
Right.
Um, and in Latinx communities, right, thinking about a woman as a monster, a kind of like, where do we get these categories? I think monstrosity is created around this idea of anything that bumps up against this some person's or some group sense of moral respectability,
Hmm.
right? And so that can happen in so many different ways, but it can happen in like, so I read Bernadette Galafel, who's a communication scholar, writes about monstrosity.
Yeah.
And she writes a very, to me, a very emotionally affective essay about how she is framed as a monster in her department, right?
Yeah.
And part of that comes from physical attributes, this idea that her body isn't the right size, her arms have dark hair on them, she's loud,
Hmm.
she's outspoken, she's political, she's a full professor. And
Yeah.
but there's this idea of the characterization of how she's not the kind of Latina they would want in their departments
Hmm.
or the kind of woman that they would want in their department. And so she is rendered monstrous,
Hmm.
right? And already, once you're rendered monstrous and everyone can sort of agree, everyone in your circle agrees on it, then we go with the distancing, right? So the monster's over there and we're over here and it's us versus this monster, and that can only grow. because it's us and them.
Yeah, yeah,
And so for me, the idea of my own monstrosity, right?
yeah,
You know, I'm a single mom, I'm queer, um, you know, um, I live away from my family, I'm tattooed, I'm a fat girl, all these things, right? That socially and culturally in different ways, I have been I have been socialized to understand as being contrary to who I should
yeah,
be.
yeah,
And in a lot of ways, I feel like I wear that identity with pride. And I think so
yeah,
part of thinking about this story, thinking about, like, again, the category of monstras, right, has
yeah,
been reading and learning about different sort of legend stories that have female monsters and
yeah.
trying to understand exactly, like, why is she a monster? I'm confused. So,
Yeah, yeah,
an advocate for monsters everywhere and trying to disentangle, like, that perspective. Why is this
right.
she a monster? Why is this happening? Um, and so that's kind of what I'm thinking through, with La
Ugh,
Lechuza.
I love it. And I love, I mean, first of all, I love that you've used so many different ways to define monster because it is such a hard thing
Oh
to
yeah.
define. It is constantly changing and moving and dependent on circumstance and
Oh
like,
yeah.
and I want to make sure I'm not putting words in your mouth. So you've
Mhm.
mentioned kind of pushing the boundaries, right? You've mentioned this idea of uncomfortability.
Oh
You
yeah.
mentioned this idea of contradiction.
Hmm.
Is that correct? Like for
Yeah.
monstrosity? Yeah.
Yeah. And that's so I feel like a monstrosity becomes a label of being. It kind of goes back to thinking about, like, racialized, like, hyper visibility,
Mm,
or the idea of being too complicated. And I think about
mm,
this from actually a consumer perspective, because so much of the work that I did with quinceañeras, um, was rooted in anthropological work, particularly by Arlene Davila, talking about, like, Latino consumers. And there was
right.
clearly the divide between, like, the consumers that were easy to define and the consumers that were not easy to define. And
Yeah.
so there became this idea of, like, oh, I'm definitely the, you know, modern bilingual-ish, not really readable, right? This idea of being unreadable. And
Hmm.
I think that part of monstrosity is the idea of taking on or having an identity, or being willing to project an identity, rather, that, isn't easily readable by wider
Yeah.
society. And part of,
Mm,
like, so we don't understand why your body shifts into a werewolf form and you grow hair, right? This idea of thinking about, it's like, but we know that it's different from what we understand. And so very
yeah.
clearly, right, you're in one category and lichens and werewolf are in
Yeah.
another. And
Yeah.
so this idea of, you know, I mean, yes, we can think about, like, metaphors of difference, right, that are used. But I think, yeah, monstrosity is scary, not in the way that we think it is.
Yeah.
Like, it's not that just the surface, like, depictions of what frightens us or
Hmm.
what stops us, but I feel like it literally becomes a bias against anything that makes us uncomfortable, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And from my perspective, is because I'm really thinking about gender identity, right? The
Yeah.
idea of gender identity, thinking about shape shifting. And so I can already tell a lot of the work I'll be thinking about isn't just, thinking about this public affect, this Latina affect. How are we allowed to be in the world, which is a topic that came up in the first book as well. But how that connects to things like non-heterosexual, non-binary, trans. Like, the idea of, you think
Right.
of some of the metaphors in a lot of our legend stories, the scariest thing is something that is unidentifiably gendered,
Mm,
or is
mm,
transforming in your front of your
mm.
face, and that merits violence,
Yep.
right? And so I was like,
Yep.
oh, this sounds really familiar. Like, we definitely should talk about this.
Yes.
So all of that
Yes.
kind of thinking has brought me to La Lechuza.
So who is La Lechuza, Rachel?
So La Lechuza, well, the term lechuza is,
Hmm.
a barn owl.
Yeah.
It's the Spanish term for a barn owl, and owls, have a variety of symbolism in Native North America and, Indigenous North America and Central America.
Hmm.
Um, And so La Lechuza, generally speaking, is a witch who has the capacity to shapeshift into the form of a giant bird, particularly an owl. And
Mhm.
so when I say La Lechuza um, is a specific woman in a community who's understood to have leveraged her soul to the devil for the power to shapeshift.
Mhm.
And she's seen as a predator, bird of prey, right?
Yeah. Yes.
She's, but what's interesting to me, so she's someone in the community. She's seen as a real living person who has this alternate identity at night, and supposedly she terrorizes men.
Hmm.
But I think it's interesting that as an idea, she's supposed to scare men and women. But I've never understood her or have yet to hear a version where she hurts or harms a woman.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
know that's probably possible. But
Yeah.
that's yet to be determined by at least the text that I'm collecting from folks. The story itself is really part of fronterizo Mexican American border culture. I
Yep.
didn't grow up with this story at all. I came to Texas 10 years ago for this job, and I taught a folklore class, and I had a student who shared the story of Lechuzas in her northern Mexican mother's town.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And she's like, You've never heard of this? I was like, and I checked my cryptid map, which I keep at home,
Yeah.
and I have it on the wall. And I was like, it's not accounted for. And I was like, there's a big bird or something, but that's not what they're talking about. Like, there's a big bird in South Texas that's like marked, and like, but they're talking about like a thunderbird or a condor. It's not La Lechuza.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. And so I just started asking more questions. And this particular student was an older student, and she was talking about living in Austin and having two young sons and being in a park in downtown Austin near the water. And she remembers she was with her boys, and she remembers hearing the owl, an owl
Oh
hooting,
boy.
probably and during the day. So she was like, this was wrong. And so this owl hooting, and she immediately was like, grabbed her sons and like left because um, she absolutely felt that that was not right, that the owl was there either as a warning or as a threat of um, particular danger. But what's interesting is that we talked about this. She's like, no, nothing happened. I was like, okay. She's like, but I think maybe she was warning. They were because again, this idea of physicality, that the owl was
Yeah.
warning us to leave. I was like,
Yeah.
not that they were, and so I was like, okay. So we talked quite a bit about what could that mean. But she
Ugh.
said she had brought her beliefs from growing up in northern Mexico with her parents, um, and so that sort of that gave her a certain filter for the presence of that owl. And she was like, I'm very certain, like that owl didn't belong there, shouldn't have been out during the
Right.
day, was far too large. And so like there was all this belief, and I was like, that's great. Like, let's keep talking. And so I actually interviewed her, I think last summer. I'm collecting some of her mother's stories of Lechuzas. And so this idea, so here's sort of the origin narrative around La Lechuza. And I do teach a class on legend tripping
Of
in
course you
Latino
do, because it's
studies. It'd be
amazing.
super cool. It'd be so fun. But part of it is that because I'm in Latino studies, I kind of have to be interdisciplinary about how I teach it. So I have to
Hmm.
start with like the monster, serpent goddesses of indigenous Mexico or indigenous
Ugh.
Latin America, and think a little bit about how we think about monstrosity and how it's connected to colonialism. And so
Yeah.
I was, talking to the student and thinking a little bit about like, how do we understand the lenses, right, that we bring to these stories? So I had students like bringing in like origin stories, and do you know where this comes from? They're like, no. I'm like, all right, well, let's dig it out. Let's find out. So the sort of general origin for La Lechuza is there's a small town in the Texas Mexican border. That could be anywhere, right?
Right.
There is a little boy who goes missing. And so it's very vague. A little male child that goes missing in this small town, and people blame this woman who they believe to be a bruja, believe to be a witch, who lives
Right.
on the edge of town. And of course, her parents are the parents of the child are good, upstanding, Christian citizens of this town. And so a mob forms because they assume that the little boy went missing. It had to have been the witch at the far end. A mob forms, torches and pitchforks types things, goes to her home, pulls her out, and burns her at the stake.
Hmm.
And so again, a kind of classic like witch burning story, but with the idea that there's the claim is that she mutters sort of like a curse that she'll come back and wreak vengeance on these people for their unwarranted attack and murder of her. And so this to me was really fascinating because I was teaching a class on women in academia and using Silvia Federici's work on witch hunting and thinking a little bit about the cultural shifts of like the medical industrial complex, colonialism, and this idea of women being healers or parteras, birthers, those helping people give birth, to a system that was run by science and men and indigenous ways of knowing. And so part of that is thinking a little bit about the vilification of a woman who lives alone without children at the edge of town. Right. And this is where I get back to thinking about I'm a monster. I was like, that's me. What does it mean? What does it mean to be unprotected? And so the idea that someone living on the edge of town who's somehow able to survive on their own without a husband, without a father, without, let's say, an older son or somebody, like able to, and this idea of the power of a woman who has her own homestead, who might have her own garden, who, probably makes herbal remedies for people in the town or helps women when they're pregnant. But in that moment, her difference, right? She clearly was clearly a victim of their perceptions that she was a bad woman, because bad women don't live alone and don't not have children, right? No. And so to me, this was fascinating, right? Because I was thinking a little bit about like, okay, so this is the origin story, and now what you have are people taking that story and laying claim to, there's not just one lechuza, but the role of a lechuza in a community, right, is a role that can be taken up by any number of women or practitioners of brujeria. And so they're all over sort of the cultural community and system, and men and women, all good people, right? All good people are taught to fear this creature, right? Something subhuman or something that has no soul because they've sold it to the devil, right? You can thinking about preying on communities that are Catholic or Christian in spirituality, that have grown up absolutely fearful of the devil, right? We can think about other legends and like U.S. Mexican fronterizo communities like dancing with the devil or spirit possession, right? All of these ideas. And so La Lechuza becomes this, she's a victim who then becomes an aggressor. And so what you have then is any woman in a particular community, right, who seem to have power, whether it's the ability to live on their own, this idea of maybe, they can live without the same strictures as what's assumed to be a respectable woman. So what keeps everyone behaving right? Well, my daughter's going to be a good girl, so she can get married by a certain age. She can have a husband. She can have children. She can have a respectable life. And in a paper I gave last year at Western States Folklore Society, I was talking a little bit about how, to me, Lechuzas occupy a sense of like queer temporality, right? Their life course does not follow the life course. When I think about, let's say, quinceañeras, high school graduation, maybe college or meet your spouse, get married, right? They're on a completely different sort of alternative time frame, and that is upsetting. That is sort of part of the life that vilifies them or makes them subject to criticism more than anything. And so to me, then I started thinking about this idea of like Lechuzas as resistance, Lechuzas as a kind of vigilante justice. So I started thinking a little bit about that and why that's important, like just the idea of it. And I'll share with you here and with your listeners and watchers that
please.
I was the victim of sexual violence in college. And so for me, and it's been a long time, but for me, there was a point in my 20s and 30s that like I learned to shoot a gun and I got a permit. Like I was fearful, but I also was really interested in the idea of vigilante justice. Like in my mind, it was sort of this fantasy of saying, if I saw someone on the street that was hurting someone, like in
Yeah.
my mind, I felt like violence. I felt like I could do that. I would do that. I wouldn't let someone else get hurt in
Yeah.
that same way. And so thinking about, but that would still be a crime, right? I was still, I understand, the idea. But so in my mind, part of me, that idea of the lechuza and the story of like, so when do people encounter la lechuza, right? Just to put that into
Yeah.
context, lechuzas tend to come out at night, right? They're
Mm.
nocturnal creatures.
Yes.
And they tend to, the generic story is usually, let's say, men going out at night, men drinking, carousing, maybe coming back from a bar, right? And being followed or being,
Right.
tracked by the
Stalked
owl.
almost. Yeah.
Absolutely
Mm-hmm.
stalked,
Mm-hmm.
and finding themselves under like physical attack late at night when they're slightly incapacitated, and then coming to maybe with scratches, or with some other kind of attack, not necessarily murder, but disappearance. I think also occurs depending on the community. But the idea is that they come back with this story of this violent creature that overtook them in their drunken stupor and when they
Hmm.
were out late at night, and
Hmm.
then that story then gets treated as, oh no, this is what it was, right? It's
Right.
this woman. It was I was being attacked by a bad woman, as opposed to saying I was a victim of something at night, because being out at night is dangerous. We tell our girls this all the time,
Hmm.
but male victims, it's different. It's something to be all of us should be afraid of.
Yes.
And so this is really interesting as we think more about the kinds of the characteristics of men that occupy these stories. And so a lot of times the idea of alcohol use, drunkenness, being out really late at night.
Yeah.
And so part of what I've been thinking about are how these stories are um, coded to deal with issues like violent partners or violent
Mm.
fathers, or thinking about like, that character on his way back home to maybe a
Mm.
wife and children, right? And what would come
Right.
of that. And so for me, thinking a little bit about the Lechuzas watching, right? The Lechuzas waiting, not for a man to be vulnerable, but to be in a position to protect others. And so to me, that's extremely powerful. So I've been hearing stories about people knowing the Lechuza was near because they could see it across the street for hours. Like my father said, the Lechuza watched the house, or
Mm.
hearing the flapping of wings. Um,
Mm.
this woman swears that Lechuza got caught in her, or was coming through her family's chimney, and so they could hear
Mm.
the feathers, and they were terrified. Um, one of my students said she collected a story from her uncle, who said he swore that his ex-wife, he saw her shift from the body of a woman into an owl and um fly off their porch and never come back. And I was like, that's cool.
Whoa.
I know. And again, but so this is really that interesting to me because it's very much a story that's told in their family. And so
Yeah.
part of this is saying like there's this deep embedded belief. And part of I'm talking to my student, like, so you think, what do you think? She's like, I don't know. He said he opened the back door and saw her. I was like, maybe she left him and like he didn't, like we were talking about like what sort of psychological states or emotions are these stories also um protecting people from by having them, but also how do they serve as a form of communication
Mm-hmm.
across a community, right? When someone says, "Oh, I have a Lechuza story," actually, it's my partner's father. They're from Laredo,
Yeah. Oh, okay.
and he was telling me, he's like, he called me one day and said, "Do you know what a Lechuza is?" And I was like, "As a matter of fact, I do."
Well.
And I was like, "As a matter of fact," I'm like, "Where did this come from?" And he's like, "No, my dad's best friend went into the hospital from high school." went
Okay,
into
okay.
the hospital recently with a heart attack. And they said that as he was getting wheeled in, and they were like, what happened? What's going on? And all he said was La Lechuza. And I was like,
Ooh,
was he cheating on his
ooh.
wife? I'm like, what kind of fellow is this? And I was just, all I could think of was like, for me, again, in my mode of thinking was like, I wasn't saying like, oh, did he, what did he get hit in the head? What's wrong? No, it was more like, what kind of man is he? Is he a
That's what you go
womanizer?
to.
That's what I go to. I was like, and so this idea of sort of this coded language, what does it mean? And this goes back to thinking about all the good work that's been done on La Llorona and
Yeah.
thinking a little bit about the stories of how we have such different interpretations now of the capacity for La Llorona's story to be
Right.
an indicator of so many other sort of happenings, right? With the Lechuza and sort of that kind of reference, to me, I was thinking about how people tell stories to inadvertently implicate someone as maybe an abuser or as violent without ever saying it, right? Oh, did you hear
Mm.
about La Señora's husband? I heard he was chased by La Lechuza again. And is that subtext of that is to say he got drunk and beat his kids again? And so
Exactly.
the idea that he's deserving of someone coming for him. And I think that is powerful as well, right? The
Oh,
coded language
hell
that
yeah.
becomes possible because we realize, like, and again, we say this a lot, or as folklorists or like just in general scholars, right? Thinking about whether communities have voice or why does it's kind of that classic, why did she stay? This idea of these social narratives that really vilify victims who maybe don't have the capacity to speak up. But also, we see that there are different ways in which people do tell their stories and they tell them
Mm-hmm.
within these really culturally relevant ways that aren't always legible to other people. Um,
Yes.
so for me, that's really why this story and all its versions and that I'm collecting is so powerful. If only because it's this kind of insight into the good woman and the bad woman, right? But the idea that the good woman cannot exist without the bad woman, right?
Mm.
It's just socially, right? And the idea of how these stories codify like a sense of respectability and rules that follow us, right, for generations.
Yes.
But at the
Yes.
same time, I think it's very much about women culturally and socially in Latino communities in particular who share these
Right.
stories, kind of fundamentally understanding that the state is not on their side.
Mm.
This is about saying, and I feel like I hear it repeated things like, feminist studies or even Chicana feminism, right? The kind of narratives of support. And you realize like the state's not going to save us, right? The sheriff and the mayor who know that upstanding citizen who beats his wife, right, in their small town, right? There's these kind of narratives of like, how does justice actually flow? And so thinking a lot about how women in particular, or women or even trans or marginal gendered communities, right, in particular, right,
Right.
have to, tell stories of almost like solidarity, right? And the
Yeah.
idea that we take care of
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. We have to take care of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes, I think, extremely powerful as we think about like trying to understand the bonds of mothers. I have students who have to break in their career, academic career, because their single mom needs them at home with their siblings. Like there's a different kind of
Yeah.
loyalty and understanding um,
Right.
who cares for us. And so these stories to me are about the monster, but it's very much about this caricature of a woman that we need, right?
Oh,
But
yes.
in that heroic way, will be on the margin
Of
because she
course.
has to be at the margin to work, right? The
Mm-hmm.
work that she does. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
that's just powerful to think about the ways in which um, our communities over generations, Chicana, Latina, fronterizo communities that live in the borderlands of legality, of
Mm-hmm.
criminality, of poverty, all of these things, right? Are like, look, we on some levels, these narratives keep us going, right? We understand where justice potentially could come from,
Yep.
and the idea of we work with the resources we have. And so for me, I think that's extremely powerful.
And I love that you said that because, and I think, and I'm sure you relate, right, to, of course, I think just as a Latina, right, like proving yourself constantly in so many
Oh
different
yeah,
ways, whatever academic sphere, normal life,
right.
generational trauma, whatever. But also, I think in the folklore world, I think trying to prove how important folklore is, and that your field of study is so necessary and so
Mhm.
vital for communities, and what you're interested in is so important, right? Because I think monsters, folklore, what have you, right, don't get a good rap. They get like, oh,
No.
that's stupid, that's silly, that's
Right.
childish, right? Or
Yeah.
whatever people say. And it's like, you don't understand, as you mentioned, these stories and these metaphors and these monsters are, for many of us, the only way we can talk
Yeah.
not only to, or the world or what have you, but to our parents, to our
Hmm.
brothers, to our sisters, to our
Right.
little cousins, to
Hmm.
our children, right?
Yeah.
Like it's so much. These stories are so weighted and
Yeah.
so layered, right? And that's why I think it's so beautiful that with these personal experience narratives that you're collecting
Yeah.
with La Lechuza, you can have such complex discussions
Oh
about
yeah.
domestic violence, right? About the idea of machismo or
Oh yeah.
marianismo with your students, with maybe not even saying the word, right? With just
Absolutely. No,
talking
you just
about it.
yeah. But
Ah,
I think you're on like, and again, this is about how communities, we talked about this before, and like folklore in general, or Latino folklore, like thinking about how communities are intellectualizing what they're doing. Like
yeah.
people understand this. It's just that we're not asking the kind of questions, or we're not reading these texts like we would read literature. And that's sort of classic in folklore, like thinking about how people are talking. But I think
Sure.
it's even more important as we think about like diasporic Latino communities. Because one thing, so thinking about La Lechuza was really hard to sort of narrow to, because there are a lot of shape shifting female monsters across Latin America and across the
Oh, I see.
Caribbean.
Yeah.
And to me, that is extremely powerful, because
Yes.
that shows us the sort of common ground of sort of gender and class and violence that a lot of us have dealt with, are dealing with. And we create, so, the DR and the Caribbean, there's a Ciguapa, a very
I love
similar
La
Ciguapa, right?
Ciguapa.
In San Antonio, you have the Ciguanaba, and
Mm.
further south, the Ciguanaba is a so. And I love this because when I talk about predatory women in classes where there's men, which there rarely are, and it's always a little bit like, oh, this is men bashing. I was like,
Oh,
I'm
come
telling you the
on.
stories that we're listening to, and it's like, well, the depiction of what is a monster, right? And the
Right.
idea that a man might find himself out at 3 in the morning after the bars close. And then in the distance, going towards a dark alley, he sees the back of a young woman with long hair who's, young and scantily dressed, and decides he needs to go over to her, someone he's never met. And the idea that he follows her wherever she's going. And then as he approaches her, as they get to a more desolate place, and she turns around and has a monstrous face. And the Ciguapa, it's a skeletal horse face, and essentially she grows hooves and she clobbers him. Um, like, whose fault is that? I was kind of
Mhm.
laugh. I'm like, no one told you to go stalk a young woman that you don't know while drunk at 3 in the morning in the distance,
Yeah.
and stalk her until you could touch her. Like, that's
Come
on
on
you, babe.
now.
And
Yeah,
so part of it,
literally.
yeah, I was thinking about, and then in Puerto Rico, there's not thinking about the Ciguapas. Who am I thinking of? Is it no? It isn't the Ciguanaba, but it's another creature that, again, that has
Yeah.
sort of this physical deformity where their feet are backwards. That's the Ciguapa. And
Ciguapa,
thinking
you're
about,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
Ciguapa, right? This idea of
I love it.
how a sort of this, usually like a naked body, or a body
Mhm.
that's seductively uncovered from the perspective of a male
Mhm.
gaze, right, is then pursued. And then the realization is that she's a monster, and that the idea that you kind of, there's strategies of her body, is that you can't get away from her. You think she's the one direction, she's going the other.
Oh, I
And
love
there's
it.
this idea of thinking about, like, we've been doing this too long to, because if we think about the idea of what's prized in young women, tends to be innocence and
Of
ignorance,
course.
right? I'm going to marry
Mhm.
off a young girl to an older man who's fully
Yes.
aware that he's lived a life and knows things, and she doesn't know anything. And then there's this idea of these monstrous females that absolutely know what you're up to and are waiting for you sort of to walk into them and to come to exploit them, or to rape them, or to take
Mhm.
advantage of them in some way. And oh, then you become dinner. And I think that's fantastic. But it's
It's amazing.
yeah, it's these stories that saying, we know, we're not ignorant. I know we understand that there's, I think the rules of respectability say, that I am a virgin and that I don't talk about sex and I don't learn about anything, but I know there's a great big world out there. And so these stories
Mhm.
sort of offer that, like, your mother may take you to church and have you act a certain way, but you're also going to hear stories about this monstrous creature in the forest who,
Yeah.
devoured a man and he disappeared, and you're going to have to figure out how those fit together.
Yeah.
And
You
I
make a
think
good point. Yeah.
it's an interesting, it's just interesting to think about, like you said, the complexities. And we need monsters. At least I know we need La Lechuza, because
Yes.
her story's still being told. She's still very much feared and reviled. But I think we can complicate her.
Hmm.
Um, we can complicate her and allow sort of other stories to develop, not to replace, but just to add, right, to the layers.
Continue that conversation, and
Absolutely.
I mean, and that's so true. And I guess I never really thought about, right, like when we're younger, we were like definitely not taught about like sex or being
Mm-mm.
sexual or exploring your sexuality. Like that
No,
was just do not talk about it. Like do
no,
not, you cannot be sexy. You cannot, right? Like
no.
all of these things. And by proxy, you learn about, this world of men or what have you, sexual
Yeah.
violence through these stories.
Hmm.
And that's why we see so much of ourselves in these monstrous women is because hell yeah, they fought back.
And that's
And
very much a generational conversation, because
yeah,
I'm finding, like, there are women, older women, who I find themselves, telling me stories of fearing La Lechuza, or fearing, these very fearful stories. I was like, she's my jam. Like, why would
I
I be
love
afraid of her? Yeah,
her.
I was like, she's doing the work that, you think about, like, it becomes very personal to understand the idea of how do we think about how we protect our girls, our boys, our children, our communities
Yeah,
from really, really sort of structural and colonial violence, both in a very immediate way and sort of this structural way in terms of
yeah,
generations over generations. Um, and I think part of that, and this is sort of the last bit of thinking that I've been doing lately about La
I love
Lechuza,
it.
was thinking about the statistics, of Latina teen mental health cases and that result in suicide, and thinking about the whole wide range of how those numbers sort of have gone up in the last decade, and thinking about what girls need, or what teens, what femme folks in some ways need
Mm,
in terms of protection, right?
yeah,
And so I think these stories are part of that, part of understanding something, or part of, because as we think about the stories, and it's always been this idea of, like, there's a reason to have these stories and to think about it in this context, for me, of higher education,
yes,
because
yes,
we make these assumptions about, like, the break between the life I lived before college and all the all the facts and science I'll learn, right? And the
yeah,
idea is that those stories actually carry so much strategic knowledge about the world, but we discard them only
yeah,
because we haven't unpacked them, or we don't think they're valuable enough,
right.
right? And so I think bringing them back into this context is almost just reminding people to go back and talk to their aunts and their cousins
Of
about these stories.
course.
And I think it's very much this cycle of understanding knowledge circulation and valuing
Yeah.
sort of the histories of self-sufficiency, right?
Yes.
Um,
Yes. 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 It's so beautiful to me how these stories can, I don't know, give the older generations that have also been weighed down with guilt and
mhm.
insecurity and unknowing, um, confidence and pride
Yeah,
and feeling, I don't know, just comfortable in their own skin, powerful in their own skin.
yeah.
Like I find that so beautiful, like so incredible because they
And
maybe
it's
just
that
didn't have
capacity.
that chance.
Yeah,
Yes.
for someone
Yeah.
to come back, for those, the grandchildren who are at college, to come back and be like, let me tell you, like, ready to,
Hold
like,
on.
oh my God,
Yeah.
tell me a story. And that, I think that's very real. I'm doing projects, like, in class, that have students go and talk to your parents, talk to someone, and really having this interesting shift in value and power and just connecting, right? Um,
Yes.
I mean, you think about it. Oh yeah, I connected with my grandmother around this story of this predatory owl that like disemboweled a guy, but he was a bad guy. You realize kind of you talk about it like that, you're like, you have to understand the context. The cultural context
Yeah.
is on some level like women on the defensive, and to
Always.
have women to have a creature on the offensive who's sort of looking out for you. I think, yeah, I think that's it
Beautiful.
brought me a lot of joy to start thinking about these stories.
Yeah. I'm so glad, and I'm so glad that you're doing it because
Yeah,
it's
me
so
too.
important. It's
There's
so
stories that
freaking
need to be
important.
told.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to do the book, not like a crazy
Yeah.
big book, a small book. And I have a student who's a wonderful artist, and I told her maybe we could do like a graphic novel or something, do
Oh my
something that wouldn't
God.
that be cool to have something else out in
Yes.
the world? She's already going to
Yes.
be illustrating some of the stories, like just to, if you could, based on people's narratives, what are you hearing? How do you depict that? And so
Oh, I
trying to
love
add a
it.
visual component, because I think that's so important. I think that's what I love the most, is thinking a little bit about um, how people imagine a lechuza. And so there's some,
Yes.
artistic depictions. But she's the subject of like, like artists in San Antonio, like all these different kinds of like imaginations of this
Yeah.
creature. And I
Yeah.
think that's exciting too. What is this? What does it mean to live in the imaginary? Right? Because something that I've been thinking about a lot from an academic perspective is this idea about how imagination takes us beyond a future that is dictated by the strictures that we have at this present moment, right? And
Yeah.
that's very much like Caribbean surrealist talk, but part of that
Sure.
is saying like
Yeah.
this idea of the imaginary being so important,
Yeah.
and how we create justice in that imaginary, I think is powerful.
It's so healing, that idea
Mhm.
of escapism.
Mhm.
And I mean, it brings me back to like my the thesis work, with La
Yeah,
Llorona, with my dad, and how my dad felt safest when talking about scary stuff and being
yeah,
scared and living in this other because
yeah,
life at home was hard, right? It was
absolutely.
real and it was brutal and it was terrible, and living in that imagination and creating stories with imagination, it's so
Well,
vital.
it's so vital, but it's also, when I think of La Lechuza, I also think about like true crime, or like a period where all I watched was Law and Order, SVU. And I was
Yeah.
laughing and saying, like, I think what I like about this is that somebody cares what happens in these stories, right?
Yeah.
It's not about
Yeah.
the atrocious violence, it's that someone cares to bring someone to justice. And to
Hmm.
me, that's kind of the same way I feel about when I think about these Lechuza stories, is that this creature, no one asked La Lechuza to stalk that abusive guy,
No.
but she's out there trying. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that like that's really powerful as
100%. There is somebody that is fighting
well.
and fighting the good fight.
Right.
And I mean, we were just talking about how hard the world is,
Yeah.
and it just gives you a sense of like, I can take a breath. I'm
This
gonna
is
be okay.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah. I
it's
I think that
beautiful.
I think that means a lot. I think that it means a lot to us, anyone who identifies as a survivor, or even just the community in general. Like as we're thinking about, there is, you know, so we have, it's that kind of classical sense that there's someone out there fighting the good fight, and they will only ever be punished for it because they still are outside the structures of power. They'll never be heralded as a hero.
Yeah.
They're always going to be the monster,
Yeah.
right? And they're always going to be marginalized. No one's getting a trophy, no one's getting a sash, right? But that's the life that they're choosing to live.
Yeah. And I'm so sorry that you had to experience such hateful things because it's never okay. It's never okay.
It's
And
never okay, but it's also like a mindset that, you know, um, you think about how things form you to set you up and to put you in a path for certain kinds of to tell a certain kind of story, right? So in that way, you know, it
yeah,
it set me on this path, and so
yeah,
I can appreciate that fact at least.
good. And what do you hope in your heart of hearts, Rachel, that you can continue to teach with La Lechuza, right? Like what
Oh
is
yeah.
the be all end all for you?
I don't know. With Lechuza, I want to get my students able, right, to think about the joy, the monstrosity, like what is the work of monsters in our world, right? And
Yeah.
thinking a little bit about where the story of monsters and their own personal stories meet, because I
Yeah.
think understanding the ways in which public narratives are constructed, right, is extremely political and extremely powerful. And it's sort of like the idea of saying, clearly La Lechuza doesn't do her own PR, right? Someone else is telling her story,
Right.
hence the angle that we get of like
Yeah.
respectable men and women, right? This is a depraved murder. It's like not so much, but I think that's part of it. Part of it is using that story and thinking about like fighting the good fight in whatever way, and thinking about learning to tell your own story. I think
Mm,
that's because I think that's fundamentally part of kind of creating your own sense of values and justice. And like if you're only telling the story that you've been told to tell about yourself,
yeah.
you're kind of left with a lot more questions than answers, right? And once the source of that story is gone, you're like, wait a minute, I only know how to repeat that story. I don't know how to tell my own. And so I
Right.
think that's something that's really important for me with thinking about La Lechuza, but I also have a lot of students who see themselves on the margins of their families and communities, right? Thinking about being queer or non-binary or trans or, whatever in the
Yeah.
in-betweens. And so the
Yeah.
idea of, so for my classes, right, having students do work where they change up a legend story, a legend text,
Mm,
and make it so it would have spoken to them at a certain age.
mm,
And so some of that is really basic. Like some of that is simply like making two characters lesbian and switching one out, but still being it could still be a toxic, ridiculous relationship, but they just happen to be two
mm.
um same gender partnership, right?
Right. Right.
Um, but also things like, I don't know if I've told you this or other folks, but I've told someone else recently about, having students recast La Llorona as, okay, so all the things happen to her, and instead of her rage, her hurt, being revisited on her family, she decides, like, screw it, I'm going to move in with my best friend and we're going to raise our kids together. And
And
that's the end of the
everything's
story,
fine.
fine, right? But
Yeah.
the idea of
Yeah.
saying, the idea of especially thinking about how students have these experiences of their own lives that have been the saving grace for their upbringings, right? That probably could have been very different, right? But this understanding of this lack of social acceptability of something like that, right?
Yeah.
No husband, no hetero partner, no white, knight, then your life is over. He's like, nah, I'll just move in
No.
with my we'll be fine, and
I
to
love
sort of
it.
normalize those choices that have been framed as so lacking respectability, right? The
Mm,
idea, I mean, if you think about it, right? So in my mind, those kinds of the manipulation of these stories to make them relevant to students' lives when they work with them, I think is a big part of sort of figuring out how they recast their own story.
yeah. God. And then just seeing themselves in a story is so
Yeah,
important.
yeah. It's like, oh yeah, that
God.
makes sense, right? This is for you too. And so we talk a lot about ownership, right? And
Yeah.
the idea like this is for you.
Yeah.
And so how is this? Yeah, how do you make it about what would speak to you and maybe your neighbor or maybe your cousins or maybe not, maybe it's a different body of people, right? But thinking about how you can think through the relationship to these stories
Right.
and learn something more about yourself or begin to communicate something about yourself that you couldn't before, that's a win.
Yeah. A huge win.
Yeah,
Oh, I love it. That's so amazing, Rachel. That's so beautiful.
I hope
Oh,
it,
so incredible.
fun. Hopefully we can keep hopefully we keep teaching
Yes.
about these things and getting students to engage and yeah, bringing them folklore in these different ways, helping them
Yeah.
understand like you know the subjectivity of monstrosity and you know
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And speaking of monstrosity, Rachel, big question.
Okay.
Do you believe La Lechuza is a monster? Why or why not?
Oh, yeah, I think she's a monster when I understand that she is monstrous from the particular structural system that she was created in, that she had to be a monster to survive. and her monstrosity helps other people survive. Now, do I think it's bad that she's a monster? Like, do I think that that's when we think of like, do I think of her as dangerous to me? I don't.
Yeah,
But in
yeah.
that sense of, I think she absolutely, I'm happy she's a monster because that means she pushes back on all the elements of social life that are often forced upon us against our will. And in doing that, she is subjectively created, she's made into a monster. And so that's sort of happily, I think, and she's happily a monster, happily monstrous, living a way that she wants to live, doing the work that she wants to do. And in that way, yeah, she lives
She
as a
reclaimed
monster.
it.
She reclaims monstrosity for her own
Love
life.
it. Oh, I love it. Amazing. Amazing.
I'm glad.
Okay, well, unfortunately, last question, even though I know
Okay.
we could talk about this for
We can
5
probably
hours.
keep going. Yes.
But say you're just chilling, probably in Austin, right?
Yes.
Relaxing on this lovely
Yes.
Sunday.
Yes.
All of a sudden, and I don't know how she would enter your house. Maybe you get a knock on the door, maybe a knock on the window. I don't know. But La Lechuza appears to you. What would you say? What would you do in that
So first of all,
situation?
I think she would perch on my back fence. But I
Okay.
have had stories of people saying um, that that Lechuza broke through windows and came into their house. So
Ooh,
I know. I don't think she would do that. I think she would hang out on my I have a small backyard, but I have a fence, a high fence.
yeah.
I think she'd perch on my fence and I think she would literally I'd walk out on my porch and I think she would say, "Follow me." And she'd fly away.
Mm, would you?
Oh yeah. But I don't think
Oh,
she means physically. I think it's more of like embrace your monstrous and embrace the monster that you're fearful of being. Embrace the freedom and embrace the sense of loudmouthness of wanting to protect people, of wanting to point out injustice even when it's unfashionable or
mm,
crass, right? I think it's not letting people get away with hurting others. Like, I think it's about being unpopular. It's being the bitch who's like willing to say like, I don't think so. I think you're full
hmm.
of shit. And that's what I think that she would say and encourage.
I love it. I love it. And I think you're doing that already. And
I'll
I think that's
try.
pretty proud. That's amazing. That's
Maybe I'll
amazing.
write her a letter. Like, and put it in the book. Like, this
Yes.
is have a
Yeah.
conversation with other choose.
Yeah. Keep it going.
I'll do my
Keep being
best.
present here in this
I think
life.
it's important. It's only, because that's the one thing as we think about with it's, we can say all we want, but we have to figure out our path, right? And I think the more I connect with some of these stories, the more I'm introduced to paths that I wouldn't have expected I'd be on.
Yeah.
So I think that's really powerful for me personally.
Yes. Absolutely it is. And even more exciting when you have a guide like La Lechuza.
Yeah. She's gonna come around, like feel it.
Yeah. Yeah. She's there. This episode of Floaties for Krakens was written and recorded by me, Camille Maria Acosta. A monstrous thank you to Dr. Rachel V. Gonzalez-Martin for such a beautiful interview. A big thank you to Michael Kosman for producing a stellar episode, and a huge thank you to Natalie Hedberg for designing such a phenomenal logo. And music for the show was also written and produced by me, with a special appearance by my tata, Toby Acosta. Thank you all so much for tuning into today's show. It truly means everything to me. If you have questions or curiosities about the research or media referenced in today's episode, everything will hopefully be in the description box. And you can find us on our website and our socials, links in the description as well. Anyway, thanks again for being here, everyone. And just a reminder, it's okay to be afraid of the monster, but it's also okay to love the heck out of it too. Keep being monstrous and keep shining bright.